King Slime is a production of iHeart Podcasts and Heirloom Media. I'm Christina Lee.
And I'm George Cheedy.
And this is King Slime.
We're coming to you with our last episode.
Right.
And it's a bittersweet, but we're going to make it good because we're here with the wise and powerful Joe Coscarelli, who writes about hip-hop for the New York Times. Joe, how are you?
Hey, thanks for having me. I don't think I've ever been described as powerful, but I'll take it.
No, I mean, here we're all about first. We're all about reporting, that's really evergreen. And of course, we're joined by executive producer Tommy Andres. We'd be remiss not to introduce him.
Hey guys, cheers to the last one, huh?
Yeah, this is such an interesting conundrum, right? Because there is still so much trial left. I would say when iHeart first gave us this deal, they maybe didn't anticipate how much trial there would still be by the end of all this. But long story short, there's no end in sight, and so the financials didn't really work out and to where our ongoing coverage can't keep going on forever. So our goal with this episode is to not only just bring you up to speed of what's been happening, do a quick touch on that, but then also just to take a bigger picture perspective on what the overall effects are going to be. And so Joe obviously is a perfect guest for that. Being culture reporter of the New York Times, as you mentioned, George, you wrote an entire book on Atlanta's hip hop scene, rap capital, and Atlanta's story. And if you remember in the very beginning of this show, you were one of our very first guests. So we're so honored to have you once again.
Thanks. It's sort of, sadly, the podcast is like a microcosm for the trial in itself, in that it's taking so long that all of these things are happening and falling by the wayside. And that it could be like the longest trial podcast ever if you guys covered Thru the verdict. You might be here in 2026 doing the same thing.
We started making the show 2 years ago. It's been 2 years already, and the trial could go till, they said, 2027.
Right. I think we might have taped our first interview for the first episode in what would have been January 23 or February, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it's wild.
I note in passing the passing of O.J. Simpson.
Oh, my God.
And I'm mentioning that because it was a lengthy trial that had a lot of media attention. And from time to time, this trial gets compared to that.
Trial of the century. Well, it was 9 months. We talked about that. Actually, that might have hit the cutting room floor, but that trial was only 9 months long.
Yeah.
The trial of the century is only 9 months long, and here we are.
Yeah, this trial is going to be longer than the O.J. Simpson trial. And the media environment then, the O.J. Simpson trial launched sort of cable news law stuff, like the 24-hour news cycle hit with the O.J. Simpson case. And I've mentioned this before. This trial has been this social media kind of thing where clips circulate on Instagram, and it's become the most important trial of all of these other sort of rap trials that have been happening, partly because it's nuts and partly because it reflects the media environment that we're in.
I know, trying to keep up with the demand has been an absolute doozy. I've definitely felt susceptible to, I don't even want to call it the 24-hour news cycle anymore, because somehow that doesn't accurately capture the pacing of everything. But I guess on my end, I should say, I don't want to speak on behalf of Tommy and George, but I certainly felt pressure to meet the demand for any sort of insight, any sort of clip, any sort of takeaway that was going to catch people's attention of this trial.
And yet on the flip side, I would say this trial also represents its media moment as a counter to something like the O.J. Simpson trial, which was such a monoculture zeitgeist thing where everybody was paying attention to the same thing. Yeah. Whereas I feel like this trial, both because of its length and because of the sort of fractured nature of media and music and popular culture, is a little bit underrated in terms of how crazy it is. The people like us who have been following it since the indictment or before, we're all in. But then most people, I feel just have a passing even someone like Young Thug isn't as famous as he would have been if he was Young Thug in the 90s, And
Mm-hmm.
so they're sort of I know vaguely there's a rapper on trial. It's both such a complicated and long lasting case that I feel there's there's a chance people will gather back around for the verdict whenever that is. But I do feel like it's sort of like most things in news and media, just like floats by most people.
Whenever that is.
It is crazy how people will ask me what I do these days or whatever. I'll meet somebody at a party or whatever. And it's amazing the percentage of people that still have no idea who Young Thug is. When I started, they're like, oh, it sort of sounds familiar or whatever. I'm like, why, you haven't heard of this person? I mean, obviously, that strikes me as strange because we've been focusing on it so intensely for 2 years. But I think you're right. Like the hip hop spotlight is very bright, but the broader sort of news cycle is so swallowed up with all these other huge stories. I do feel like this one is sort of getting like cast aside in a lot of ways. It's not even the most focused on RICO trial right now. It's like there's a lot going on.
Well, speaking of a lot going on, I'm going to try to make this as succinct as possible because it's been a couple weeks since we last caught up with you guys, and I'm going to do my best to very succinctly talk about like what's been going on since we last did a court report. So we, I think, have finally heard an end to testimony regarding the red Nissan incident that happened in May 2013, where not only Adrian Bean completed his testimony, but we finally heard from investigator David Quinn. I would say that was one takeaway. The other takeaway is regarding an incident that isn't even part of the indictment. It was a part of what has been called a robbery, where essentially, there's so much we could get into this, but a woman who is identified as A. Bennett says that she heard a knock on her door one night, looked and saw that it was friends of her baby's father, Young Thug, Walter D.K. Murphy, and then Young Thug's brother. Let him in, but then all of a sudden gets a gun held to her head and she gets robbed of a couple possessions.
Do you recall telling the police that you opened the door and let Thug inside your home?
No.
And do you recall telling the police that you turned your back on Thug's brother, and a person you called DK to walk into the kitchen to make your baby a bottle?
No.
Do you recall telling the police that when you went to the kitchen, Thug's brother put a silver 9mm to the back of your head?
No.
And then on top of that, there has been some, I guess, admonishing on Judge Glanville's, and where he's talking about like, hey, this trial is going on for way too long. We need to take some hardcore measures to make sure that this trial is expedient as possible for the sake of the jury. So he's talked about earlier start times. He's also addressed timely discovery and the need for all of that. And then finally, the person who's currently taking the stand is someone who is one of the co-founders of YSL, and that will be Walter D.K. Murphy. He is expected to continue taking the stand after we record this episode, so potentially a couple days after. So it's a lot. George, as you're paying attention to all this, like what's sticking out to you?
So let's start with this. The judge, it has become entirely clear to everybody, including apparently the judge now, that this is taking too long.
We can't be talking about like multiple Super Bowls. Like that's just crossing a line.
It's madness. And so he's issued an order, and a fairly stern order. And the question is whether or not he's actually going to hold to the order to try to speed things up. He's essentially limiting the kind of objections and how those objections are going to be held and when a jury will be brought in or taken away, and how much time will be taken from the court for extraneous stuff, and to hold court on Saturdays and Sundays if necessary, which is extraordinary and difficult and expensive because you've got to have sheriff's deputies, a bunch of sheriff's deputies in the courtroom. You're committing 10 other people to overtime in a sheriff's office that doesn't have extra bodies to give to it. So he issues this order and then still continues with the daily delays. Like court was supposed to be starting at 8:30 on the dot, and it's not. It's 9. It's 9:30. Comfort breaks that are supposed to be 10 minutes turn into half an hour or longer. And the objections that he's objecting to are still flowing more or less in the same way. And he's getting testy about that.
All right, I guess you all will be working this weekend then, because this is exactly what I told you was going to be a problem. You bring this stuff up, I got a jury sitting in the box, and you got a witness that you're probably going to have days of examination with.
Yeah, he and Steele have had some really harsh back and forths. It's been tense.
You tell in front of the jury how unprepared I am. And let me tell you something. I am not unprepared. I don't appreciate the court telling me that. And you don't, and I asked you, tell the jurors that you were wrong when you admonished me last time. You said you wouldn't do that. This is the second time. And you know what it does to me? I don't care. I'm hurt because you're a court, but I really don't care. But what does it do to Mr. Williams?
Mr. Steele, I'm not trying to personally insult you or hurt your feelings, okay?
Forget that.
You are a grown professional advocate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's adding to, I guess, like, thanks for reminding me, Tommy, there was a motion to disqualify DA Adrian Love from the whole proceedings. That's how testy things have just gotten in court in general. And of course, like, that was denied. But still, that kind of speaks to, like, the acrimonious nature that has really been bogging down the trial. Right.
And I don't see that changing until Fonnie Willis puts the hammer down. And I think that moment is coming. If this is still going on in the way it is when the Trump case is also absorbing the attention of the court and of the sheriff's office and everybody else, I think she's going to make a triage decision.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see. I mean, with Glanville getting so frustrated, we've talked about this a little bit in our preparation for this episode. It's just like he's really where the buck stops, right? I mean, he's the conductor of the orchestra here. So for him to get so mad at how slow things are, it's like, bro, like, what are you doing? This is your show. You're the one running this. So if I'm a juror and I'm sitting in there and this is happening and I'm just like, oh, great, I get to give up my weekends now too? Awesome. I'm going to be here till Super Bowl 2027 or whatever the hell the date is that they keep saying this thing's going to go till. And I got to come in on weekends. Like, get out of here.
That number for like 2027 didn't come out of nowhere. It's simply taking a look at how many witnesses have been heard and how long each witness is to take, and then looking at the 160 more witnesses to go. In that order, Judge Glanville also, like, there was an attachment for all of the witnesses yet to come. And we're actually starting to edge into the evidence that, if you've been a listener to this podcast, would be very interesting to you. Kenneth Copeland is on the witness list, probably 15 or 20 names down. He's only listed by initials, KC, but It's got to be him. Some of the investigators that we've spoken with on, like Investigator Gaither, is coming up.
Marissa Viverito
is coming up. And there are others that we've spoken to that are coming up soon. And when they come in, you're going to start hearing some more of the evidence that's much more substantial and much more relevant than 2013 car chase.
The 9 weeks of red Nissan testimony.
Right, exactly.
But I was going to say, like, no matter how many 30-minute breaks get shortened to 10 minutes or even how many weekends you come in, like, the amount of time we've spent so far on essentially witnesses sort of superfluous to the main facts of the case, plus however many witnesses are to come, 100 plus, 150 plus, as George said, like, this trial is going to take forever, no matter how much fat is cut from it. You know what I mean? Like, this jury is in for many, many more months, realistically.
Yeah, and the pipeline for the rest of Fulton County is getting clogged like crazy. I mean, so Carrington Matthews has another client, I read about this a few weeks ago, who is awaiting trial and will not go to trial because he's defended by Carrington Matthews, and, so they've made special accommodations. So he won't go to trial for another year at least. I mean, whenever this thing wraps is basically when this guy's going to go to trial. They're just waiting for that, which seems crazy. I mean, it's like, so you've got this family whose relative was allegedly murdered by this guy who has to wait for justice for that long. Plus you've got this guy who has to sit in jail and await his time because of something that has nothing to do with him. Mm-hmm. So in addition to, Young Thug and, all of his co-defendants being caught in the system for so long, you have this trickle-down effect that's really crazy. And I think we'll start hearing a lot more about that soon.
Name that wasn't on the witness list. Gunna. Gunna is
What do you
not
make of that, George?
just this, that our sort of initial look at what Gunna was charged with and the evidence that they might have was probably on the spot, that they didn't have a lot and that they wrapped him in because he had money and they wanted to take him off the table for a little while. Like, that's the only plausible explanation for why they would have bothered with him in the first place.
What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, his charges, as George said, were so far from, again, the main crux of this case, specifically, the murder of Donovan Thomas and some of the more intense weapons charges that came later. And there was a lot made about the nature of Gunna's plea, whether the Alford plea actually differentiated him from some of the people who took deals. The DA's office was very adamant that if called to testify, he would in fact be required to testify as the other people who took pleas. And then Gunna's lawyer was very adamant on the other side. I'm sure multiple people on this podcast have had unpleasant phone calls regarding these issues, potentially, that Gunna would never be asked to testify. So I think it's possible there was a little bit of a wink, wink, like we don't really need the guy because whatever he's copping to in his plea is going to be proven 10 times over by the time we get to trial.
Right.
And the facts of the counts that he was in firsthand, I just don't think would require him, especially if he was going to be the sort of difficult state's witness that we've seen thus far, in which people who have taken pleas are trying to say as little as possible to fulfill their duties.
Okay, so we've talked so much about like how this trial might be perceived in the eyes of the jury, right? Because they're the ones who are ultimately going to rule on this. But one thing we wanted to ask you about, Joe, is how this trial is being looked at the eyes of other artists, the sort who might have been afraid that rap music was really going to be put on trial in regards to YSL. Could you give us some insight into that reaction and how that's evolved as it's continued to stretch on in ways that we've talked about?
I would say overall, my main sense of surprise is how quiet the music industry has been about this trial. I think, you have your free thugs here and there. You have songs on albums that seem to allude to him, which maybe we'll get to later in this conversation. But at the same time, there's not a huge galvanized effort, like there may have been in past hip hop trials. And I think part of that has to do with, as we've alluded to, both the fractured state of media and news. Like even Trump news comes and goes like multiple times a week at this point. And Trump is, degrees more famous and potentially consequential compared to Young Thug. But also the facts of the case are unwieldy. I think people don't exactly know what to make of it and where Thug fits in. I think people see, artists, industry people, local Atlanta music scene people, they have a deeper understanding both of the facts of the case, but then a surface level understanding, I think, as most people who have lives and fast-paced careers like rappers or musicians or managers or label people, like I think their understanding of the facts of the case itself are quite cursory. And you might, you see headlines on social media, you get the viral moments when someone's testimony goes above and beyond. I think people know, I think the overarching feeling is that this case is a mess. And maybe that's going to help Thug in the long term. I think most people are just sort of going to wait and see, and we may see, like I said earlier, a rise in the profile of the case as we get closer to jury deliberations and a verdict. And then I think is when we'll see people really come out of the woodwork and respond. But I do think overall the reaction has been fairly muted. I don't know. Do you agree?
Yeah, I feel like I haven't seen a whole lot. I guess first, as we were reporting this podcast, we did speak with Prophet with Black Music Action Coalition, who posited that maybe there is fear in the music industry from wanting to speak out, especially given the strong reaction toward Gunna one way or the other. It just seemed like they would rather just not be involved in something like that whatsoever, and so that they don't get bogged bogged down by that as well. But so he was alluding to the fact that there might be fear in people speaking out. But then on the other hand, it's like, yeah, we had a lot of trouble, I think, reporting the podcast, even just in getting people to comment on the whole thing. It seemed like even from 300's perspective, like, so like one person that I really, really wanted to feature on the podcast was anybody from 300 Entertainment, especially as they were like ramping up, you know, the Rap on Trial campaign and everything and wanting to get people to sign a petition. I thought that would actually be the easiest thing in the world on our behalf, but I was shocked by how much I was like shut down. So I wonder if they've even sort of like tamped down on the response, you know, just to not make such a big deal out of it. But yeah, it's been really challenging. I feel like in one way or the other, it's been really hard to hear like from any sort of artist perspective on what this is like. Like the studios didn't want to touch the news. Like none of the artists who maybe even have a tangential relationship to Young Thug wanted to comment on it. I thought it was really interesting.
So we're not seeing a ton of people like comment on it directly, or I mean, occasionally, I guess we've seen a few. Like Drake obviously weighed in when that the jail phone call was leaked with Mariah the Scientist. He was pretty pissed off about that.
He also did a video early, like which was like where he flashed free YSL.
Well, so this is what I was going to say. So the free YSL stuff's obviously been out there quite a bit. But Joe, I'm wondering, we have seen Young Thug featured in a bunch of songs since his arrest. Came out with a full album, has been featured in a bunch of songs, and I'm wondering what that shows. Like that's obviously, I would think, some level of support too, right? Like continuing to put Young Thug in your music?
Yeah, I think there's two levels of it. There's the implicit or explicit show of solidarity of either appearing on Thug's album, which seems to have been mostly put together from stuff he'd recorded previously. If we know anything about Young Thug as an artist, it's that he's extremely, extremely prolific and recording at all times, you know, in the mold of his idols like Gucci Mane or Lil Wayne, both of whom had stints in prison that were also very, you know, ultimately very productive for them musically and creatively. So I think there's that. And then I think there's probably a business reality of it too, which is if you're either buying, paying for, you know, a Young Thug verse or contributing to his eventual royalty statements by featuring him on, you know, a big album or two, you know, that's a form of material support for somebody who, you know, has had most of his avenues for making money frozen by sitting in Cobb County Jail for, you know, going on 2 years now.
So you think that most of the music that has been released since then was stuff that Young Thug had already recorded?
That's my assumption. You know, I think there's been a little whispers here and there, you know, going back to the first song on the original release of Business is Business, which features Drake, and has a call between Drake and Young Thug on the jail phone.
Yo, what's up, my brother?
What's up, my brother? Talk to me. What's the word?
Oh, I ain't doing shit, man. Just pushing more Peter, more sweeter, more completer than any Peter pusher around.
And then when Thug's verse comes in, it sounds to me, to my ear, as somebody who uses voice memos a lot to record interviews, it sounds like it could have been recorded on an iPhone. And it seems to refer to being in jail or something about his current situation. So that may be a newer or newish verse since the arrest. Most of the other stuff, you know, seems a bit evergreen. And again, like there are countless producers, engineers, I'm sure with hard drive upon hard drive upon hard drive of unreleased Thug music. You know, there's a real history of this in rap, you know, Gucci being the best example. But even this past week, Thug put out a song with Lil Wayne, which to me was extremely noteworthy because Wayne is in the details of this case, in between the lines, as somebody who may have had you know, potentially almost fatal static with Thug and his allies at some point. You know, I think they've only done one song together previously, maybe two. So I felt like Wayne putting something out with Thug at this moment, that's like that's a real show of like sort of almost reaching across the aisle to say, like, we may have had our differences in the past, but with you against the criminal justice system, like, I'm with you.
Yeah. Going back to what you said, Joe, I mean, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts because you kept alluding to Gucci Mane. I think what I remember from those Gucci Mane days, especially when he was dropping tape after tape and then just prefacing it with like jailhouse calls after the other, you would get like the long extended like 2-minute intro, like calling from Fulton County Jail. And then it's just like completely garbled on the other end. I feel like there was so much more mystique around how that was possible. And Gucci wasn't even the first. He was just the most prolific and the most brazen about it. Whereas I think now fans have such a bigger understanding of the fact that artists are just constantly producing and therefore have this backlog to be able to produce even when they are being jailed. So maybe now I think maybe the muted fan response toward all this comes from just fans like understanding like, you know, like this isn't new. Like, it's not all that interesting to hear from Thug at this point in time, just because we've seen how this has happened before.
Yeah, and there are also rappers who have taken it to an even greater level, like someone like Draco the Ruler, who's since passed. But when he was in jail in LA, he recorded an entire album using the jail phone, and it was called "Thank You for Using GTL," which is like the message that comes up when you're on the phone. So he recorded, entire verses through that. So, we could still see something like that from Thug. There's also, as we know from this trial and many others, like a ton of illegal phones going around in jails across the country. So there are ways that I think, like, who knows how long this thing goes on, and at some point he might be itchy to put something out. So there are stunts. I think there are a lot of eyes on him, so that probably limits what he can and can't do. But at a certain point, you could see someone like Thug rebelling against those strictures.
In terms of support and just sort of like a view on perspective on Young Thug, Joe, you've got sort of an interesting viewpoint because you obviously have spent a lot of time on the streets in Atlanta and in the studios to write your book, and just somebody who had come to Atlanta you were basically living here for a couple of years, I would assume, writing that book. But you also obviously work for the national paper of record, and so you've got this wide lens view as well. Do you think there's a difference between how people in Atlanta see Young Thug in this trial and how people nationwide see Young Thug in this trial?
Definitely. I think to the extent that Thug is known nationally, he played the Grammys with Camila Cabello. He played SNL with, the guy from Fun and Gunna, like right before the indictment. I think Thug is known as this sort of like outre mystical creature, right? People know the dress from early on, the couple dresses, the cover of the mixtape and the fashion shoots he did. They know him as this sort of whimsical guy with the crazy voice, and you never quite know what he's saying. Comes on the radio and you're like, who's this guy? And he played with Travis Barker, on NPR. Like he has this chameleon-like persona, and is almost like funny and playful in this way. But there's another side of Thug that I think the prosecution is trying to paint in this, and that also people who may have known him longer or seen him on a more street level are familiar with, which is like, and it's there in the music if you're really listening, whether or not that's true or not is obviously what's at stake in this trial. But that's like the tough guy Thug. That's a Thug who's like not to be messed with. And he built up that persona, both himself and with the people he was around. You have characters in this trial, someone like Pee Wee Roscoe, who was convicted in the Lil Wayne tour bus shooting that I alluded to earlier, and who's once again wrapped up in this RICO. People testifying now who have been in and out of prison, or people indicted alongside Thug who are already incarcerated. Like there's a sense that there's a street level lore about him that I think Atlanta knows that didn't really trickle up into the mainstream.
Yeah, and that even came up in our reporting. So, like, as you were talking, Joe, I was thinking about a comment that Bane Joyner gave us that unfortunately I don't think actually made the episode. I don't know how I let this slip, but
I might have cut it. Sorry.
no, you're good.
That's what producers are for.
That's right.
So Bane Joyner, for those who don't remember, he is 1/3 of a creative consultancy that created like this unofficial slogan for Atlanta, which is that Atlanta influences everything. And he's an Atlanta native. He was talking about how a whole decade ago, like specifically around the Lil Wayne tour bus incident, how there was that lore that you were talking about, Joe, and that really it was from people like you had to be on the pavement. You're not driving your car through 75, 85 traffic. If you were going through MARTA, if you're going to the public library, that's where people were having these conversations about Young Thug and this outsized reputation of his, not necessarily for music, but for what was supposedly like happening in the streets. So it's interesting. It feels like our sources check, so they say.
We'll be back after the break.
So I'm sort of sitting here thinking, and I want to, I'm sorry to take this in a random direction, but I've been thinking a lot about the cost of all of this. I'm sort of, as we're talking, I'm going through the numbers for what the judge makes, what every sheriff's deputy makes, what every
some of the defense attorneys are on the on the Fulton County tab.
The number that I keep coming up in my head is $5,000 a day.
That seems low, though. You think it's only $5,000 a day?
I'm being generous,
but still, you multiply 5,000 a day times, even if that's the lowest it could possibly be.
Yeah.
Times
times
4 years or whatever this could be, 5 days a week.
Like it's a minimum cost for 10 sheriff's deputies making $55,000 a year, plus a judge at $150,000, plus a court reporter or the court administrator making, $80,000, and another, like the person taking the notes making $50,000, plus 2 prosecutors sitting at the table. A minimum of $5,000 a day. So $5,000 a day, and they've been in court, I want to say about 300 days since the start of the trial.
Including the jury selection, yeah.
And I kept, to your point, Tommy, about stuff being delayed. As you're talking about that cost, I'm wondering about how that cost multiplies the more cases get delayed, right? Because as I'm watching this trial, specifically with testimony regarding, it could have been anybody. Investigator David Quinn, Miss Bennett, all these, Walter Murphy. Everybody's talking about how, it's been 10 years since, this happened. And when they say they don't remember, honestly, it sounds believable in that moment, no matter how much, we may think that they're trying to dodge, giving the truth. So I wonder how that effect multiplies, over time. So if, for example, a trial gets delayed by an entire year, how does that affect the justice system from being able to deliver a speedy trial, where if the more time passes, the more their memory continues to fade? And so, I wonder how much longer trials after this, even the ones that are supposed to be expedient, just grow to where, I don't know, I just feel like there's probably some horrifying looking graph that's gonna, come up over the next couple years about how much the justice system is just costing us, period.
And it's why I keep coming back to this idea that, because Fonnie Willis said at the start of all of her term, I'm going to be doing a lot of RICOs on gangs in Atlanta, and I don't care.
The papers were going to be clear from the office. That's what she told us.
Yeah. And so here we are. And there have been a couple of other racketeering cases and gang cases that have come through her office, but mostly it's not her. I'm seeing stuff in DeKalb County and Gwinnett, one in Cobb, a bunch of stuff around the state. None involving marquee name rappers. Mm-hmm. Bear in mind, I am unaware of any meaningful accusations.
I'll let you know, George. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Well, but even think of YFN Lucci. He was sitting from a year before the YSL case, and then he got a plea deal. Is that plea related to how long the YSL trial was? Obviously, they were waiting for that to clear up before they tried Lucci and his crew for what is basically the flip side of the beef at the center of this thing. So even that, it's been years and years.
Yeah. Like my thumbnail guess is from the first indictment on the YSL case, sitting here, I'm saying it's about 2 million.
Oh man, I think you're low. I think that's low.
Yeah.
I also
and think of the incarceration costs on top of that.
I did not. I am
incarceration
not
costs. They've been investigating this
accounting.
for 12 years too.
Sure.
So
no,
like you've
I'm
got
saying just
if you-
from the arrest.
It'd be fascinating to sit down and figure out how
Magic
much
City
this
lunch
costs.
too. You got to include that.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think you got to charge that to the court. Chad, I think you had to pay for that out of pocket.
So
but,
the out of pocket, the cost per inmate at Fulton County is about $18,000 a year. So 6 left, but 6 times, like that's another. You're right. That's another.
yeah, I think it's going to be tens of millions at least.
I don't think it's going to be tens of millions, but it doesn't have to be to throw the whole system into chaos.
You really don't think it's going to be tens of millions for, like, if you took in all the total costs of this? I don't know. It seems like it's going to be a ton.
Well, and there's one person who really is going to have to answer for this at the on the ballot, right? And that's fun.
Funny, yeah.
I mean, this is all for the sake of crime, right? Targeting crime.
And that's the thing. I mean, they'll point to the numbers and they'll say crime is down. And we've talked about this a million times. And right, like the numbers basically show that, yeah, crime's fallen a bunch, but also the numbers they're pointing back to, and they did this in our interviews, were artificially spiked because of COVID. I mean, there was a big rise in crime, violent crime during COVID.
I want to put that couple of $1 million number in perspective. The district attorney's office has a budget of about $41 million. And so one case, one trial is taking up,
a significant portion,
2.5% of the entire budget, which is to say they could only do 20 of these and nothing else. Like,
not to mention the other blockbuster case looming, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so, I mean, we're not talking about insignificant amounts of staff attention and the resources of the agency. It's like, I mean, it really is. It's like there's nothing left. Like once you start getting at all of the essential, necessary, doesn't matter what's going on, expenses that the district attorney's office is going to rack up just at the cost of doing business. They don't have $41 million to spend on cases. They've got like 20.
Well, and what happens if Young Thug either gets off or negotiates a settlement like, YFN Lucci did, where he's time served or something like that? I mean, what happens to his reputation? It seems like as a figure, and Joe, I want to actually ask you this, but it seems to me that would potentially embolden him and make him even a stronger player if they think he's in this, like allegedly in this street gang stuff, but also in the music scene, just like a bigger presence overall, right? I mean, we've seen this happen with artists who have beaten the system,
Oh, I mean, America loves an outlaw, and hip hop loves an outlaw, and that's behind these personas, real or fictional, in the first place, right? Think back to Tupac or Snoop beating a murder trial early on in his career. Jay-Z sort of being Teflon in his way. This only adds, like, this is if Thug gets off. And think of the peak he was at, even when he was arrested. People thought Thug's career was over 5 years before that, and he'd hit like a whole new level. If he gets out again, it's like it's John Gotti the first few times when you get a hung jury or a not guilty, like, then his persona, it only grows. And I think the interest that people will have in whatever he does next. I mean, even look at Gunna. People said by taking this plea deal, Gunna was dead and gone in hip hop, and he's bigger than he's ever been, not only musically, but sort of like persona wise. People want to know what's going on with this guy, how he sort of slithered his way out of this, even if it was in a way that people initially thought was going to harm his credibility. I think, we've seen now that people's memories are short and this trial is long. It's so long that Gunna has been both dead and reincarnated at the top of the charts before we've even gotten to the good witnesses.
George, I thought this would interest you because I guess prior to Young Thug and friends being arrested, there was a show at State Farm Arena, right? You were closely monitoring it. Trying to see whether the show would still go on in the aftermath of everything. Gunna is going on tour in May. It wraps in June in Atlanta at State Farm Arena.
Oh, my word.
That is all. I just wanted to point out the irony to you.
Full circle.
Yeah, and nobody is saying, oh, God, we can't have this.
Yeah, we need to FOIA the extra security costs paid by the county for that one.
There you go.
Oh, I would love to see that. Paid for by the county. So that's the thing. I doubt it. I think the State Farm folks would be like, no, I'm gonna like write a check, like just raise the ticket price by $1 and hire all the off-duty sheriff's deputies in town.
But it'll be interesting to see how Atlanta hip hop responds to that. I assume it's Gunna's first real show in the city since his plea, but people are slowly coming back to his side. You know, he's has a video with Offset from Migos that came out a couple weeks ago. They appeared together live. I think you got to imagine people are starting to come out of the wings and think like, okay, like, is it cool to collaborate with Gunna again? Like it only takes one and then two and then three and then people forget.
It's like a domino effect. So that's so interesting because we've been wondering this entire time in making the podcast. One, what sort of chill effect this trial would have on crime in Atlanta? And then two, what sort of chill effect this might have on music that is coming out of Atlanta? So, I mean, Joe, I've kind of had my head buried under the sand and trying to keep up with all the trial proceedings. So I'm mostly steeped in Atlanta trap nostalgia at the moment. But what's been going on in Atlanta? It seems like shit's more brazen than it's ever been.
Yeah, I think the idea that, rap lyrics would come from a more guarded place now that they were being used in criminal indictments. Like the issue is, and I think this goes to the broader question of crime, one RICO case against one alleged gang in one part of Atlanta does not rid the city of the circumstances that birth this kind of music. There are always going to be kids from nothing who feel like they have nothing to lose, who want to let out, the basest, most vicious emotions over a beat. That's what hip hop is. That's what Atlanta rap is. And if you pay attention at all to the underground, to the unsigned talent coming out of Atlanta, as Christina said, like it is as vicious as lyrically and sonically violent as it's ever been. I think the drill effect around the country, 10 years on from Chief Keef in Chicago, that sound and that super hyper local nihilistic violent subject matter is like still what is extremely popular. I thought, maybe we were coming out the other side of it, probably unrelated to the Thug trial. But you think of someone, there's a buzzing artist out of Atlanta right now called Baby Kia, and his viral song is called OD Crashin'. And the first line in the song is like, I'm walking on Believeland with that stick. Like it's straight out of this trial, and he's naming names, there's specifics in this song. I don't know, if they do or don't refer to real situations, but the idea that a song like this exists with the Thug indictment as headline news in the city, like I think that's as much of a middle finger to the system as you could imagine.
Let me tell you, I run I guess I've got the folks who care about what I think come from a particular demographic. Like they're older Black guys who can shout at clouds and get off my lawn a little bit. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough that they will come up to me and say, this drill music, I am worried about this drill music. And to some degree, to the degree that the street is talking to me, and please don't assume that the street is talking to me. But I think there's a disconnect between the industry, the music industry, and the underground music that you're talking about. You don't have to have a label to make music like Baby Kia. Like anybody can put that up. Mm-hmm. And so, even though the labels in the industry may be like, whatever, I don't think the kids gotta care.
I wouldn't be so sure about that, though. I think the amount of Atlanta rappers, with 100,000 YouTube views who I see on Instagram in label offices taking meetings. There's never going to be a shortage of business people who want to make money off of street level talent. I think, you might be quieter than it used to be. They're not gonna pop a bottle of champagne and post it to Sony corporate Instagram. Maybe it's done through an imprint or, a JV label or whatever, or it's a distribution deal, with a company like Empire. There are a lot of different ways to do this more creatively, I think, than there used to be, but also the labels have never really been held responsible for any role that they have in this. We've heard from the beginning of this trial people saying, well, why isn't anyone holding the white executives responsible? And that continues.
Yeah, I was one of those
that's a mostly rhetorical question still.
Well, it's interesting because YSL, is obviously a label, and I signed up a long time ago for these text messages that would update you when they had new YSL things. And I get those still. And it's kind of weird to get a regular marketing text about YSL stuff when all this stuff's going on. And I wonder, is the label still basically functioning the same way, or has it been impacted dramatically by this? Do you know?
I think a label like YSL is so dependent on its principle, on Young Thug, basically. It's basically a miracle when you can get a second artist on an artist's imprint to pop at the level of Gunna, and the fact that they got Gunna to be as big as he is and continue to be, presumably he still has some sort of contractual relationship with YSL, despite the whatever distance there may be personally, but between the people involved. So I think often, you think of someone like Unfunk, Thug's brother, who was involved in this case, and I think is back in prison having violated his probation. Most of the artists under YSL, other than Gunna, are Thug's closest friends and collaborators. They're people who were attached directly to him and who he was giving a chance to directly. So I think it's very hard for a label that exists because of one man to succeed without that man, but that doesn't mean there aren't artists trying. You think of someone like Strick, who's out here, I think, trying to carry the torch. There are always people like that, but I think Thug was the engine, and YSL only exists. A label gives Thug YSL as basically like a bonus to say, not only do we want you, but we want your friends and family too.
And I guess on that same note, George, is YSL the gang, alleged gang, is that still functioning if they believe it's out there?
From what folks have told me, and again, take this with a grain of salt, YSL is a function of Cleveland Avenue. As long as Cleveland Avenue exists, a kid who's grown up there is going to call himself a YSL gang member if they're going to be ganging at all.
So it's just like saying where you're from, basically. But that runs counter to everything that the prosecution's been trying to argue.
No.
Okay, well, that's just taking that.
But that's why this is such a tricky case, because these hybrid gangs, these cliques, the way this culture works in Atlanta, it is not the typical way that people think of, a top-down organization, a mafia-style organization. That is not what this is. And I think that's the struggle that the prosecutor's office has here, is explaining this sort of amorphous thing in a way that tracks for a jury, while also saying that Thug is at the top of this pyramid.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how the jury responds to DK's testimony in particular, because he did touch on this, right? So much of that testimony was about, so how many of these defendants are YSL? How did they become part of YSL? And how does all this shit work? First, he looks around the courtroom and he's like, okay, I know maybe 2 or 3 people here. The rest of them, I have no clue. And literally, let's see, DA Simone Hilton, she's going through the list. She's like, okay, well, how do you know this person? Well, I know them from the studio. Versus Cleveland Avenue, versus if somebody was on the west side, DK would scrunch up his face and be like, I have no fucking clue. I never go to that side of town. And then meanwhile, it's this amazing quote about how I guess the question was, how do you become part of YSL? And dude was like, I don't know. You could literally just go and say it. You could say you're YSL as much as you could say that you're Muslim or Christian.
Was YSL affiliated with any national blood gangs?
Yeah.
Who or what?
I don't think it's just blood. I don't think it's like no particular individual. No.
So you say it was just blood?
It was blood, Crips. You could be anything to be wise. You could be Muslim, Christian. YSL, it wasn't no, you gotta be this to be wise. No, it was just, you wanna be YSL, you can be YSL. Nobody said you can't be YSL.
And I'm just thinking about like how the jury's going to receive all that. Now, granted, they don't have to take his word on it. But if that's going to be coupled with all these explanations about what a hybrid gang is, like that's a really tall order.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that when we were looking at, we were listening to these witnesses describe what a hybrid gang is, you know, these police officials and these detectives, and it sounded really squishy. It was like, oh, it's this, it's also this, it's also this. It felt like a very convenient, you know, hole that you could basically put any type of peg into. And I feel like that, if I was a juror, I mean, we've talked about this already, but if I was a juror, I would be like, reasonable doubt is what I'm holding this to, and I don't know if we're getting there.
Right.
You know?
I want to come back to something really quick. So you referenced Baby Kia and Strick. And you are, again, a mighty journalist with the mighty New York Times, and you were referencing street rappers who, like, I mean, you'd have to Google. Like, I mean, if you were like Joe Listener from Marietta.
Sure,
like,
yeah. I'm saying, I'm like, I might as well be making these guys up.
Got like 3 million views on YouTube, though, is what I saw. You know?
Well, that's just
Sure,
it. Like this distance between a signed member of the label YSL who's got a distribution deal and is getting pushed by like Sony Records or something like that, and a Baby Kia who's got, you know, a bunch of YouTube views, like, is small. If they're both capable, if you are a person who is capable of registering that they are culturally relevant and somebody that a New York Times news reporter can talk about, like the distance between the street and some boardroom in New York is not great anymore.
And that's rap today. That's hip hop today.
I was about to
and
say.
that's and specifically in the streaming era, in the digital time. Like this is why I think we've seen so much death and violence and court cases and indictments within hip hop. It's like the bar has fallen to where you can call yourself a rapper, you know, and you can have a viable career with no guidance and no chance to move out of your bad neighborhood. And, you know, like this is what I wanted to document in my book, Rap Capital. Like this stuff happens there. And especially in a city like Atlanta, which is known for creating stars over and over again, there was this gold rush when all of a sudden the music business was booming again. And any kid on the street who appears in the background of a Lil Baby video can get a deal for a couple tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and even more. You know, you get a verse from Young Thug, and all of a sudden you're signing for $1 million. But $1 million is not a lifetime's worth of money. You know, and these things grow quickly, but they crumble just as quickly. And I think that's a lot of the tension that we see here, especially when you pair that with the lifestyle that, you know, people want to see in this kind of music, the OD crash and lifestyle.
So it's less that more rappers are alleged gangsters and more that alleged gangsters are getting into rap.
That's definitely what the prosecutor's office says. You know, that increasingly these hybrid gangs are driven by rappers. You know, we had my colleague Richard Fossa and I in the piece we did. You know, Marissa, you guys mentioned earlier, gang investigator, said the new colors are the rappers, and people line up behind them. So that's the case that they're trying to make. But it's not so simple. You know, you think of, you know, even trying to explain to the jury what the DA has done here, that like some of YSL are Bloods and some of them are Crips. Like that doesn't compute to people whose understanding of gangs comes from 90s or early 2000s popular culture. It's like it's completely at odds. So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in trying to tell a linear story here.
More on the way. Stay with us. I feel like we're wrapping it up, right, guys? This feels like we're taking our final lap here. How do we finish this thing? 2 years. What do we do? I don't know what to do at the end here.
Let's start with this. Like, I will still be writing from time to time for Rolling Stone about this case. I've taken a long-term, like a year. I have a 1-year contract writing about democracy for The Guardian, and I'm covering the South. But that doesn't mean that I'm walking entirely away from watching the Young Thug trial. I'm just not going to be there every day, sitting there, listening to testimony. I'm going to catch up. And as the really important things come in, like, when Little Duke testifies, or if Kenneth Copeland takes the stand, I'll know to come in and I'll write something. And hopefully, listener, you can find that. And I'm not sure what Christina's plans are.
Yeah. George, we talked about this. I have no idea. All right.
Yeah. Hey, your Rule 22 is still valid, You still go and just hang out for fun in court.
Christina, I know you'll stay at it too.
I mean, yeah. Absolutely.
However you can.
However I can. I mean, this case has just proven to be so much more than I could have anticipated for when Young Thug was arrested and when Gunna was arrested. I had this perception of how this was almost sort of this was a trial concerning a rap superstar, and that his music was being scrutinized. And part of that is true, but so much of what this trial has encompassed, it's been the most complicated local story in Atlanta that I've certainly tried to follow. It covers just a decade's worth of the city trying to wrap its mind around how the city is changing in general, and who gets left behind as a result, and how the crime dynamics sort of reflect that. I think, my mind is just completely scrambled up on this whole thing. So I feel like I have no choice in a way than other to keep up with this trial, because I literally don't know anything else at this point. It's just
I'll say I took parental leave recently in the middle of this trial, and from covering it at the Times, which I wasn't doing in the way that you guys are. Some of you guys are day in and day out, mm-hmm. But I was swooping in, and I was thinking oh, maybe it'll be over by the time I get back. I'm gonna miss writing the verdict story for the New York Times, mm-hmm. And yet here we are. I'm about ready to come back to work, and we're not even close. But I do just want to shout out the people like you guys, George, Christina, been covering this at the ground level, all the local reporters who are doing such a great job, Michael Seiden, mm-hmm. At WSB, Joseph Papp and Shadi Abu Said at AJC, Jewel Wicker covering for national mm-hmm. outlets, and then people coming in and out, Kathy and Megan, who you guys have had on the show. And, there's really, I think, going to be a cohort of people who stuck this out and documented it for history. And I do think it is important on multiple levels. So just shout out to you guys for this show, and to everybody else sort of in the courtroom and on the live stream every day.
Well, thank you so much. You can't really end better than that, right? And I will say we were rewarded for this. We really appreciate the listeners, because, this show, we haven't even mentioned this, but this show is nominated for an Ambie for Best Documentary Podcast for the year. We just got back. That's why we missed. That's why we missed a week for the show, is because we were out at the ceremony for that. We lost, of course, but hey, it felt really good to be nominated. And so I think the response to this show, has surprised us as well. We're just three fools that started sitting behind microphones and making something. And so we've been really thrilled with everything that we were able to do.
Yeah, and I think people, to Joe's point, might not even fully understand the repercussions of everything that's happening now, but I'm confident that a couple years removed, we're really gonna come to terms with just how much this trial actually means. And then maybe that's when we'll actually win Best Documentary Podcast, once people realize how important we actually are. King Slime is a production of iHeart Podcasts and Heirloom Media.
It's written and produced by George Cheedy, Christina Lee, and Tommy Andres.
Mixing, sound design, and original music by Evan Tyre and Taylor Chacoin.
The executive producer and editor is Tommy Andres.
Our theme music is by Done Deal.
For more shows from iHeart Podcasts, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.